Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the Agriculture Extension Agent with the Cooperative Extension Service here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. Welcome to Saturday's seminar, Wood Pallet and Straw Bale Gardening. Our speaker today is Phil Roudebush. Phil has gardened for many years in Mississippi, Kansas, and here in Buncombe County. He's grown large gardens and small gardens, and he's learned that sometimes bigger isn't better. So he's glad to bring us some innovative solutions for our Saturday seminar theme, gardening in small spaces. Phil is a retired veterinarian and researcher, a Buncombe County Master Gardener volunteer, and a clever and creative gardener. So please welcome Phil Roudebush and learn about gardening with straw bales and wood pallets. Take it away, Phil.
Thank you, Allison, and welcome to everyone for our discussion today about wood pallet and straw bale gardening. I've been gardening in one way or another for over 50 years and always looking for new ways and new methods to enhance my gardening pleasure and just to try something new. About a dozen years ago, I added wood pallets and straw bales to my gardening repertoire. I hope I can give you some ideas today about how to add these to your gardening endeavors. We're going to talk about wood pallets first, and wood pallet gardening I've broken into two sections. First of all, talk a little bit about pallet basics, and then talk about how I have used wood pallets in my gardening efforts. I also say there aren't very many published articles about wood pallet gardening, but the best way to get ideas is to simply go out to your favorite search engine and type in wood pallet garden. Just click on images and you're going to see hundreds of examples of how people have used wood pallets in gardening efforts. And I'm going to show some pictures today that I got off the internet, talk about some of the things I've done, but I would encourage you to do that. And we'll really give you some new ideas of how to use wood pallets for gardening. First of all, where do we get pallets? Well, these are a few ideas. One is if you do a search on wood pallets here in the Western North Carolina area, you're going to get several suggestions. One that's relatively easy to access is the Mulch Lady, who's on Riverside Drive, right next to Riverside Stump Dump here in Asheville. Will go ahead and sell wood pallets. Some of the big box stores, you can buy wood pallets off their back loading docks. In another city, I would buy wood pallets off the back dock at a Menards, and they would usually just charge me about $3 a pallet. Many hardware stores will carry or have wood pallets. About a month ago, I bought wood pallets at the Ace hardware store in Swannanoa. Other hardware stores may carry those. Some garden stores will carry pallets and sell pallets. One example of that is the Jesse Israel Garden Center at the Western North Carolina Farmers Market. Will sell pallets for gardening purposes. You can use social media, Craigslist. You can find wood pallets there. You can put an inquiry on Facebook Marketplace. And so if you're used to using social media, that can be a source of pallets. And then finally, I do what I call dumpster diving. We have a number of construction sites with new homes in our neighborhood. And oftentimes you'll see very good quality wood pallets in the dumpsters. I always go ahead and check with the laborers or the foreman at the construction site to make sure it's okay. But dumpster diving at construction sites is actually a way to get pallets. And you're going to find many other sources as well. But those are a few ideas of where to start. So it's important that you get the appropriate wood pallet for gardening purposes. The IPC, which is the International Plant Protection Convention, was actually established in 1951 as an international effort to prevent and control the introduction and spread of pests of plants and plant products. And of course, wood is a plant product and is a way that plant pests can be spread not only internationally, but within the country. So they created the Commission on Phytosanitary Measures, and that's really the governing body that's set up regulations around the transport of plants and plant materials. As of today, there are over 180 nations that have signed on to this convention and follow it, not only for the international shipment of plant products, but also a shipment of plant products within a country like the United States as well. So there's two primary ways that the Commission has set up to treat wood products to prevent the spread of pests. One is heat treatment and the other is chemical treatment. As you can see here, heat treatment means that that wood product has been heated to a temperature between 132 and 140 degrees for a period of time, which will kill all known pests. It's also good to get a pallet that has been debarked. So sometimes you'll see that signature on a wood pallet, or look for pallets that don't contain bark, because certainly bark is more likely to carry plant pests than just regular wood. Sometimes you'll see a designation that the pallet has been kiln dried. This has nothing to do with preventing pests, but it means that that pallet will be less likely to warp over time. For gardening purposes, we always want to use a pallet that has been heat treated rather than chemically treated. The chemical that's primarily used is methyl bromide, which can be toxic for both plants and people. Here's a picture of what you might look for on a pallet. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is the IPPC logo. You can see here it has MB and DB, which mean that this has been debarked, but it's been treated with methyl bromide. This would be an example of a pallet that we wouldn't want to use for gardening purposes. On the other hand, if you look down here, this is sort of the ideal designation you might see. Here is the IPPC logo, and this is HTDB, which means it's been heat treated and debarked. This is sort of the ideal situation. What you're really going to find on pallets is something that looks like this, but you can see HT for heat treated, and down here HT for heat treated. And again, this would be an example of a pallet that we would use for gardening purposes. Let's talk about all the different ways that you might be able to use wood pallets. Again, you can get good ideas by just searching on wood pallet gardening in a search engine. One way I like to use wood pallets is literally for storage of garden tools. The picture on the right is from one of my barns in the past. For 20 years, I had a 40-acre horse property, and I had two different barns, one that had 4 stalls with horses. So I took a number of wood pallets, just nailed them up on the inside of the barns. In one barn, the kind of the non-horse barn, I kept my tractor and gardening equipment. I just nailed that to the studs and kept my gardening tools there. In the horse barn, I kept the pooper scooper and all the other utensils that I needed to maintain the barn. So I really find that, especially in a barn situation or a shed situation, it's an excellent way to manage tools. I found this picture on the internet. I think it's unique. They've taken the wood pallet and they've attached it to the back of the shed or the garage and used it for maintaining tools. You can get lots of other ideas around that off the internet. They are also an excellent way to create very quickly compost bins, and you see different ideas here. You can have the traditional 3-bin type of compost bin. We have a compost demonstration site at the Western Farmers Market at the Jesse Israel Garden Center. About a month ago, I built a compost bin there out of wood pallets. I just put it together with very strong zip ties. And so if you want to see an example of a compost bin made out of wood pallets, just go out to Jesse Israel. I have all 4 sides zip tied together. If you were using this at home, you could use one of the sides just to temporarily tie it in place. It's an excellent way to start making a compost bin. If you're going to use it for what I call vertical gardening, then what you're going to want to do is take that wood pallet and somehow put a backing on it that will hold soil or potting mix. Probably the easiest way to do that is with landscape cloth. Usually I'll use a double layer that's shown here in the upper right-hand picture. If you get a good quality staple gun, what you do is just go ahead and staple that in place, not only on the bottom, but on the sides of the wood pallet. Then you can go ahead and put in potting mix or some type of container soil mix. You now have something that you can stand upright and use as a vertical garden. Here's a picture of a woman who's done that. She's put landscape cloth all around the pallet. She's put in the potting mix and planted the plants, and that now can be stood up. Again, these are pictures that I've taken from the internet, but they're just good examples of the kind of vertical planting that I've used wood pallets for in the past. If you have a small place like the deck of an apartment on a patio deck, you can use that. I like this picture in the lower left hand because they've actually painted the pallets and made them decorative. I'll show you another example of that in just a few minutes. And in this case, they've hung that on the side of a stone wall. You can put flowers, you can put herbs, you can put lettuce and other vegetable crops that can be grown in a vertical garden. Here's another example on the left of where they didn't use hardware cloth and soil, but just literally used it as a vertical surface to hang pots. So lots of different ideas and ways to use wood pallets for vertical gardening. More pictures, a great way to grow herbs, a great way to grow other plants. I've used the technique in the upper right-hand corner where I took 2 wood pallets, put backings on them, and then just lean them up against each other. You can do that on a hardscape. You can do that in your yard. I did it in a traditional vegetable garden as a way to increase my space. This shows in the lower left strawberries. It's a great way to create a strawberry planter. And the upper right is a picture of using it on the deck of a patio. You can also use it as a horizontal planter. It's sort of an instant raised bed. I've used it on bare soil in a traditional garden as shown in the upper right picture. You can also use it as an instant raised bed on a hard surface as shown below. You can use a soaker hose and thread that in the wood pallet and then flip it over. Go ahead and fill it with soil. Then you have a self-watering small space garden area. This shows a picture of a woman using it on a hardscape as sort of an instant raised bed, and I've done that very successfully. Examples of pictures of growing various plants, in this case lettuce and herbs. Picture in the lower right was from a deck. When I was first out of college in Denver, Colorado, I had a townhome. I couldn't really create a garden space around the townhome because I was a rental client, but it had wonderful sun exposure. I knew I was probably only going to be there a couple of years, and so I used wood pallets to create an instant garden on my front porch. Another picture of lettuce and herbs. I really like the idea shown in the picture below. I was also a master gardener in Kansas for several years before moving to North Carolina. We had a demonstration vegetable garden there that contained herbs. What we decided to do was create a wood pallet herb garden. This is a picture of what we did. We took a pallet and we just cut out every other board. That created, for a typical size pallet, about 6 individual planting areas. So we did that with 4 different pallets. So that gave us 24 places to put a different herb. We just filled that with soil and compost. And you can see here, planted a different herb in each space. Each pallet was painted a different color. And it really gave us a very attractive way to create an instant herb garden. So think creatively about how you can use wood pallets. I also found these pictures. The upper picture shows using multiple pallets to create a raised bed. In this case, they've used 4 to 5 to as many as 7 pallets and planted in the top and along the sides. And so again, in an area where you want to create very quickly a raised bed, this is a good way to go about it. Another picture of using pallets as cold frames. We'll talk about straw bales next, and straw bales are another way that you can create very quickly cold frames that extend the growing season in both the spring and the fall. We're going to stop here and see if you have questions about wood pallets. This is a picture of me just about 4 weeks ago. Visited Highwire Brewery to enjoy an adult beverage, and out there on their loading docks were these beautiful wood pallets. These are sort of supersized, much bigger than the typical pallet. And this is how they bring in their huge stacks of empty aluminum cans that they're going to package with their beer. I saw these and very impressed. They were all heat treated. And so I asked if those pallets were for sale, and they said no, but they would think about it. I'm kind of excited to go back and see if I can negotiate with them and purchase some pallets. Again, these are much larger than typical pallets you'll find. Just open your eyes and you're going to see pallets everywhere. You may be able to get those and use those for your gardening endeavors. So let me stop right there. If you have questions about wood pallets before we move on to straw bales, put those in the chat function and Allison will share that with us.
Thank you, Phil. Those look like beautiful pallets. So there is a question in the chat box about how long will a soil-filled pallet last? And also, could you explain again about, you put on the landscape fabric and you filled it with soil. How does the soil not fall out the front and just the mechanics of that?
Okay, if they've been kiln dried, will last a number of years. Certainly it depends on the amount of moisture you have in the area. The ones that are vertical gardens, when you stand them up, will last for years and years. And even the ones that I've used for horizontal gardening on soil will last a long time. So you're talking about multiple year use out of each pallet. Once you put the fabric on both the sides, you're going to go ahead and fill that. And certainly if you lean it up, you're going to have some soil loss, but if you lightly water it to begin with, usually that soil will stay. If you have heavy rains, sometimes you'll get some loss of the soil, but once the plants get established and the roots will really become well established within the soil bank, you get very little loss of moisture or loss of soil. So one way is early on, if you're just putting seeds in and waiting for seeds to germinate, you can certainly cover that with a tarp or something else to keep soil loss. But generally speaking, if you pack it in, once the plants get established, it usually works pretty well.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's our questions.
Next, we're going to talk about straw bale gardening. It's a little more complicated than wood pallets, but it's still a really interesting technique to use for small space gardening. Here we're going to talk a little bit about straw basics. Then we'll talk about the advantages of straw bale gardening, kind of placement, the bale conditioning, which is probably the most labor intensive part of straw bale gardening. Talk about different planting schemes that I've used, kind of garden management, and then finally how we might recycle or reuse straw bales. So compared to wood pallet gardening, where there aren't a lot of publications, there are a number of extension publications that are very good that cover straw bale gardening. I've listed 3 here. I think the Clemson one is very good, and actually it relates to where we are geographically. If you want to find it yourself, you can put in Clemson HGIC 1264 in the search engine and it'll come right up. If you're very interested in straw bale gardens, then I would recommend that you get this book by Joel Karsten. He really developed the straw bale concept about 20 years ago. This book is very readable and goes through all the details. You can also find information. He has a website called strawbalegardens.com. So if this piques your interest, I would recommend that you get this book, look at the website, and that's a great way to get started as well. It was the primary resource that I used when I got started with straw bale gardens about 12, 15 years ago. So first of all, what is straw? Well, straw are the stalks of small grain cereal crops. Probably the most common straw comes from wheat. I lived and gardened in Kansas for 25 years before I came to North Carolina. And of course, Kansas is the largest wheat producing state in the nation. So wheat straw was plentiful, it was cheap, it was good quality. And frankly, the wheat straw is primarily what I've used for gardening. But depending on your location, you may also find straw from other cereal crops, and these are listed here: barley, rye, flax, even rice and oats. My experience has been entirely with wheat straw, and that's primarily what I'm going to talk about today. So what is not straw? Well, hay is not straw. And so rather than the stalks, hay, of course, is the leaves and the flowering heads of grasses and sometimes cereal grains. We want to be sure that you're purchasing straw and not hay. And pine straw is not straw. We call it straw, but of course we use it primarily in gardening as a mulch. Sometimes you can use it as an organic soil amendment. But when we're talking about straw bale gardening today, we're not talking about bales of hay, and we're not talking about bales of pine straw. What are the advantages that I found from using straw bales? Well, first of all, similar to wood pallets, they are very inexpensive ways to establish a raised bed. You don't have to do any digging or soil prep. However, as you're going to see, you do have to prep the bale itself for planting. So you basically replace the digging and soil prep with the straw bale prep. You can use it on rocky surfaces, you can use it on hard surfaces, you can use them on turf grass next to your house in a number of different locations. In general, it's weed free. If you get good quality straw, generally it will be weed free, so you can forego weeding. Minimizes soil-borne diseases, and we have quite a few of those in North Carolina. Early blight is an example, soil root nematodes are an example. There's many other soil-borne diseases that we have. And if you want to try to minimize those, or if you already know you have some of those in your soil, it's a way to avoid those soil-borne diseases that often plague us. It's not permanent. So where you use a straw bale this year, you can use it somewhere else. So it's not a permanent location for a small space gardening. And then you can reuse it. You can reuse it as part of compost material. You can use it as a soil amendment. So there's lots of ways to use that straw after you're done gardening. So placement, you can place it wherever you can move that bale. There are a couple of important things. One is you want to be sure to put that straw bale where you're going to use it for small space gardening before you begin the process we'll talk about next. Because the first thing we're going to do is saturate it or soak it with water, so that bale of straw that may weigh 50 or 60 pounds will suddenly weigh several hundred pounds after you begin that process. So be sure to put it in place where you're going to use it. The other is for the process I'm going to discuss with you today, you want to place the bale so that the cut end is facing up. So for wheat straw, it's going to be real obvious that those stalks are going to be hollow tubes. And I always think about it as looking at a bunch of tubes that you're going to use for your drink. So the cut end needs to be facing up. Think about those straws and looking down on the open end. Depending on where you get your straw bale, they can be in various sizes. The picture in the upper left is a super sized straw bale, but they can be somewhat heavy. They can weigh anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds each. They can be a little bit of a struggle to put in place. Again, it's important to put them in place where you're going to use them.
Thank you, Phil. We've had a few things come into the chat box. One was a question about the weight of bales, and I entered into the box a reply that livestock straw bales may be denser and heavier than something you might get from a retail garden center for homeowners. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, my opinion is it all depends on the individual farmer. I used to get both straw and hay from a man who was very proud that each of his bales weighed 100 pounds. So I told him, since I worked with him over a number of years, that lighter was better for me. He had a young, strapping teenage boy that would haul those bales around, and he had no problems with 100 pounds, and I did. So you're right. I think it depends on how they set that machine when they're making the bales, and they can make them lighter or heavier. I agree with you that in general, certainly with hay, but also with straw, that something that you'll get for livestock are usually heavier than what you might buy at a garden center, but I think it all depends, and it can vary tremendously. The lower left-hand picture, you can see this person has created a number of straw bales just out in a yard. I like the picture in the lower right. Somebody has created a holder for a straw bale that's on casters so they can move that around on a deck depending on the light. The picture in the upper right, they've actually placed the straw bales incorrectly. You can see in this case the twine or the wire that is holding the straw bale in place is perpendicular to the ground rather than parallel to the ground. So the cut ends are on either end of this. They're using this as a horizontal planter, and we'll talk about that more later, but this is an inappropriate way to place most straw bales. It's a good place to combine what we just talked about, wood pallets and straw bales. You can take a typical wood pallet, put that on a hardscape, put that in your garden or in a landscape bed, And usually each pallet, you can put 2 straw bales next to each other on it. So you'll have air circulation underneath. It gets that straw bale further off the ground if you're trying to avoid soil-borne diseases. And it's a good way to combine the 2 techniques that we're talking about today. I like the picture on the right. They created their own straw bale holder. And again, this could be painted so it becomes more decorative. And I like this setup. I was visiting my son in Tucson, Arizona about 6 weeks ago. We visited the Tucson Botanical Garden. And in the Tucson Botanical Garden was this straw bale planter. I really like it. You can see that it's decorative. They chose not to paint it, but it has 3 different levels and each holds a straw bale. And you can see that they've planted those. Again, there are many different creative ways you can make straw bale planters if that's your interest. So those are the placement. The most important process is what we call bale conditioning. Basically, what you're going to do is create an environment within that bale that begins for that straw bale to decompose. In other words, we're trying to begin to make this straw bale into compost. And I call it let it rot. So there's really 4 key factors in composting. We need what we call browns, which is a source of carbon, which are energy for the microorganisms that are going to begin the decomposition process. We need greens. Those are sources of nitrogen, again, that the organisms need for decomposition. You need air, and we need water. Well, the nice thing about a straw bale is it already contains 2 of those 4 elements. It is a brown, it is a source of carbon, and of course, within the straw bale, you've got lots of areas or pockets of air around the individual stems. So we already have browns. We already have places where air can get into the straw bale. So all we really need to add are greens and water to get this straw bale to begin to decompose. So that's the process of bale conditioning. So this is the process that Joel Karsten has outlined, and it's one that I've used for a number of years and works really well. That's on days 1, 2, and 3. We want to completely saturate that straw bale with water. And again, this is why we want to have the cut ends of the stems facing up. So that water will not only go around the stems, but may actually go down inside the hollow stem. So here's the picture. We want the cut end of the straw up. I put in the picture on the left because certainly if you have 1 or 2 bales, you can just use a hose and water that bale. But this person is doing it incorrectly. You can see that the twine or the wire that's holding that bale together is perpendicular to the ground, and he's actually watering on top of the bale, the long end of the stems rather than the open ends. You can use soaker hoses. I also have 2 twin 6-year-old grandchildren that live near me, and they love to play with water. So I just turn them loose on the hay bale, and they'll sit there and water and water and water that straw bale until they get it saturated. And you want water literally running out the bottom of the bale. On day 4, we want to start the decomposition process by adding a green or a source of nitrogen. So we use a nitrogen fertilizer. Also, we'll typically use some type of lime, usually dolomitic lime, and what I call warm water. And warm water is basically water that has warmed up to environmental temperature or room temperature, if you will. My water temperature of the water coming out of my water line, out of my tap, out of the spigot outside is about 55 degrees. We'd really like that water to warm up to 65, 70 degrees. We've already got the bale saturated, so we don't need to use a lot of additional water. So I'll usually just take a 5-gallon bucket, fill it up with water, leave it out overnight, let it warm up during the day, and then use that. We're going to add a nitrogen fertilizer, and you can use a synthetic fertilizer that typically has about a 20 to 25% nitrogen level. So if we look at the fertilizer, remember there are going to be 3 numbers on the front. The first one is nitrogen, the second one is phosphate, and the third one is potassium. So we can use a pure nitrogen fertilizer like ammonium sulfate, or we could use a balanced fertilizer like you see on the right, which is a lawn fertilizer. If it has somewhere between 20 and 25% nitrogen, recommendation is use about a half to 1 cup of fertilizer, spread that over the surface of the bale. Then we will also add some dolomitic lime, and then use a small amount of our warm water just to go ahead and let that penetrate into the straw bale. If you want a more organic approach, you can use blood meal, and I've used both blood meal and synthetic fertilizers. Blood meal is typically about 12% nitrogen, so it's about half the nitrogen level of many of the synthetic fertilizers. So you're going to need to use a little bit more of that, around 2 to 3 cups per bale. And then dolomitic lime, about 2 cups per bale. We're going to take our nitrogen source, we're going to take our lime, we're going to sprinkle that over the surface of the bale that's already saturated with water, and then we're just going to use a small amount of water, usually with a sprinkler can, and just go ahead and get that to penetrate into the straw bale. On days 5 and 6, we're going to repeat that process with the fertilizer. We don't need to use the dolomitic lime again. So again, it's going to be the nitrogen fertilizer only, plus the warm water. Another alternative is this product called Bale Buster. This you'll actually find on the strawbalegardens.com website. It's sort of an all-in-one product. It comes with enough material to condition about 5 bales. The advantage of it is it already contains the nitrogen fertilizer. It also contains organisms of both bacteria and fungi that will enhance the decomposition process. It is a little bit expensive, about $30 for 5 bales, so it's going to be about $6 a bale to use this. It's a little bit more expensive than doing it yourself, but this is a good example of a commercial product that can be used in place of what I just discussed. On days 7, 8, and 9, we're going to continue to use the nitrogen fertilizer at about half the amount, so anywhere from a half a cup to a cup, depending on which one you're using. And again, our warm water. And then on day 10, used a balanced fertilizer. You can use an all-purpose fertilizer like 10-10-10 or 12-12-12, about a cup per bale. If you want more organic options, again, a source of calcium and phosphorus with bone meal and a source of potassium with potash, about 1 to 2 cups each per bale, and use that on day 10. And then we're done. So it's about a 10-day process. Hopefully by now, what you're going to find is that composting has begun within the center of the bale. You can actually check that with a compost thermometer, and you can get temperatures that are, as shown here, you can get 110, 120, 130 degrees. And if that's the case, you want to wait until the temperature gets below 100 degrees before you do your planting. For planting, a number of different strategies you can use there. One thing to think about is we now have a very water-saturated bale, but depending on the weather conditions, it can dry out very quickly. So we're going to need to continue to water that bale through the growing season. One recommendation, if you have a large number of bales, is just to use a soaker hose. I have not used this technique because I've usually only been managing 4 or 5 or 6 bales at a time. But if you have more than that, you may want to think about laying a soaker hose around your bale. And we can plant in holes. You can take a garden knife and cut a hole in the straw, just like you would in the soil, and you can plant seeds or you can plant seedlings. I like this picture on the upper right because it shows you that darkened straw bale. And so that's showing you that the decomposition process has begun. That's what you would like to see after your 10 days of conditioning. So we just dig a hole, we'll put potting mix in there, and we can plant either seeds or seedlings. This shows you some examples of also planting in the side of the bale. You can see the lettuce in the lower right-hand picture. It's also a great way to grow tomatoes. If you're going to grow tomatoes or peppers or something else that are going to need some type of trellising, you can put that trellis in place. The upper left-hand picture shows you can use metal stakes. The upper right-hand picture shows tomatoes planted in straw bales right next to the house. And again, the lower left, you can see a number of different tomatoes. There's a picture of Joel Karsten himself on the right, who wrote the book. This is the kind of trellising system he sets up. He sets up several straw bales, uses a soaker hose, then uses some metal stakes with a piece of wood across the top and netting. This is the way he likes to set up his trellising along with the straw bales. and shows you a picture on the left of him growing tomatoes in straw bales. How many do you plant per bale? Kind of depends. You need to think about the size that your plant may get in a traditional garden. What I've done is usually 1 or 2 tomato plants per straw bale. I've done pepper plants anywhere from 2 to 4. Squash, depending on how large the squash plants may get, I've done as many as 3, which gets to be pretty crowded. I've done pumpkins in straw bales and usually put 2 pumpkin plants or plant seeds in 2 spots. Those are some rules of thumb, but think about how big that plant will probably get in your traditional garden and account for that much space with the straw bale. The other way then, other than cutting holes, is to use it as a raised bed. And we talked about using wood pallets as an instant raised bed. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and condition the bale, and then we're going to place potting soil. I usually use a combination of potting soil and then either compost or aged manure, and typically put about 2 to 4 inches of that on top of the straw bale. And we can just plant in that soil as we typically would in any other gardening situation. So here's a good example of doing that with lettuce and with flowers and with other seedlings. I think these were beans. This picture in the upper right is a great picture because it shows you how the straw bale has begun to collapse a little bit, which means that it's been conditioned real well. You're going to continue to get heat from that composting process that comes up through the soil and can really spur on some good growth from your plants. And in this case, just putting soil mix on top, planting directly into that. These are pictures from my garden. On the left is the wood pallets. There's a good example of wood pallets. Those are carrots on the right and lettuce on the left. And then some of my straw bales, some that I haven't planted yet, and some where I've put peppers. So garden management, probably 2 things to be concerned about. One is you're going to need to add some fertilizers during the growing season. And then secondly, you're going to need to manage moisture levels because the straw bales, although they're saturated at the beginning, can dry out fairly quickly depending on how much rain there's been and the environmental conditions. So certainly you're going to need to be able to almost every day check moisture levels. If you're going to be gone for a few days or you're concerned about that, you can set up some self-watering situations like you can with large soda bottles, putting water in a hole in the cap, and that can be helpful. Fertilization, again, this is going to be a low nutrient environment depending on what kind of soil mix that you've used. Typically, I would use about 1/2 to 1 cup of a balanced fertilizer. 10-10-10 is the most common one I've used. 1.5 to 1 cup per bale per month. And if you want to use organic fertilizers, you can do that as well. So fertilization and moisture control are probably the 2 biggest issues to be concerned about with long-term management of the straw bale. Pests are still going to be a problem. So you're going to be dealing with fungal pests and bacterial pests, and insect pests are still going to be a problem. It will help minimize some of those soil-borne diseases that I talked about earlier, but you're still going to need to go ahead and use some type of integrated pest management program for whatever you've planted. So what about recycling and reuse? Well, the nice thing is you will usually get 1 season out of each bale. It depends on how much composting has occurred within the bale. I found that I would start with a fresh bale each year, and then at the end of the growing season, I would have a partially composted bale. I could just add that to my compost bin, or I would actually just go ahead and use those partially decomposed bales, go ahead and create compost pits or compost bins and use those for my regular composting activity. And as the bale continues to decompose, add that as a source of browns to my compost. There are a number of other uses for straw bales. I would encourage you to use the internet as a place to look for ideas. If you put straw bale gardens in and click on images, you're going to get lots of good ideas. Here are some that I picked up. You can use them for cold frames. We talked about using wood pallets as a very quick and easy way to make cold frames. You can do the same thing with straw bales. As you see here, you can also use them in conjunction with wood pallets to make raised gardens. You can use it to make a very quick and easy hoop house or hoop frames. So again, be creative, not only with wood pallets, but with straw bales. Be creative about how you can use those to garden in smaller spaces. So I'm going to stop there. That's the basics of straw bale gardening, and open it up for questions.
The question is about herbicide residue or carryover that might be in wheat straw bales. Do you care to speak about that?
Yeah, certainly there might be. I'm not familiar that there's a lot of issue with that. Again, in Kansas, that wasn't a problem because herbicide use wasn't very high, and there was always what I consider to be good quality straw available. I think of all the straw sources, the one that's probably most problematic might be rice. And I have not used rice straw, but I think it might be more likely to have herbicide carryover. But I don't know. It certainly hasn't been a big problem in my experience, but I'm not familiar with any specific studies that have been done with carryover.
NC State has a good publication about this, and in hay, compost, and manures, people might want to read more about that, but I agree with you. In our experience from retailers, we do not see that. The concern might be if you're buying from a local source or a hay farmer, that's local, and you're buying directly, you could just ask if there's been any sort of herbicide use on their product. But we've not gotten any reports about that. Then there was one question about using spoiled alfalfa bales. Could you speak to that? Can you use spoiled alfalfa bales?
I certainly haven't personally. I've purchased alfalfa hay and used it for horses and other livestock. I think the biggest issue, certainly with alfalfa meal that you buy as a natural fertilizer, the biggest issue there is with weeds and having weed seeds, but that probably is going to be a big problem in this situation. So no, I'm just not that familiar with using that for this.
Would the stems be different? You talked a lot about stem orientation, and with alfalfa.
With alfalfa, it's going to be alfalfa hay. It's basically going to be the flower heads and the leaves on top. And I don't think for this purpose it would work real well. That's a good question. I just don't know.
Yeah, certainly always worth a try if you have it on hand. Now, there was one last question about local sources for straw bales.
Most of the garden centers will deal with them. Some of the hardware stores will deal with them as well. The feed stores is the place where I usually start.
Okay, that's it for those questions. Thank you, Phil.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope this has given you some additional ideas to think about for gardening in small spaces. I've had fun doing it. Part of it is also learning by doing. So I would encourage you to try it and see what kind of successes you've had. And it's really been a fun way for me to expand my gardening endeavors. Thanks again to Allison for hosting, and thanks to everybody for listening.
We want to thank you, Phil, for sharing your ideas. I feel inspired. Last year, I did a straw bale based on your encouragement, and I'm thinking I'll do a pallet garden this year. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Our next Gardening in the Mountain program is scheduled for May 20th, and we'll be talking about pollinator habitats with Brian Tompkins with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So please visit buncommastergardener.org for upcoming events. As Phil has posted here, if you have more questions or need help with your gardening questions, our gardening helpline is open for calls and emails. And Master Gardeners are working remotely from home now to answer your questions. So thank you very much.